December 26, 1944, 4:50 in the afternoon. A single Sherman tank broke through the snow-covered ridge south of Bastogne. Its name was painted in white letters across the turret. Cobra King. Behind it, a column of armored vehicles stretched back through the frozen hills of Belgium. Inside the besieged town, men who had not slept in days heard the sound. Metal on ice, tracks grinding forward. They looked at each other without speaking. The sound meant one thing. Patton had arrived. If you're watching this, you already know this isn't just another war story. This is about what happens when impossible becomes inevitable. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories that honor the truth of what these men endured, subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear is not legend. It's history. 10 days earlier, the world had looked different. December 16, 1944. Hitler launched his final gamble in the West. 25 German divisions smashed through the Ardennes forest, a 75-mile front held by 4 exhausted American divisions. The attack came at dawn, no warning, just the roar of artillery and the screech of panzers tearing through the mist. Within hours, the American line collapsed. By the second day, it was clear. This was not a skirmish. This was an all-out offensive. The Germans drove west, carving a bulge deep into Allied territory. Their objective was the port of Antwerp. If they reached it, they could split the Allied armies in half, force a negotiation, buy time for the Reich. But to get there, they needed roads, and in the Ardennes, all roads led through one place, Bastogne. Bastogne was not a fortress. It was a crossroads town in southern Belgium. 7 roads converged there. Control those roads, and you controlled the entire region. General Dwight Eisenhower understood this immediately. On December 17, he ordered the 101st Airborne Division to Bastogne. Hold it at all costs. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe took command. He had just over 11,000 men, paratroopers, glider infantry, a few tanks from Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division. They reached Bastogne hours before the Germans did. By December 21st, the town was surrounded. No supply line, no reinforcements, just snow, artillery fire, and the constant presence of German tanks circling the perimeter. Inside Bastogne, McAuliffe's men dug in. They fortified cellars. They set up machine gun nests in the rubble. They rationed ammunition. 1 clip per man, 2 grenades. Shoot only when you see the whites of their eyes. The weather turned brutal. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Fog rolled in thick, grounding Allied planes. No air support, no resupply drops, just cold and the slow grind of waiting. On December 22nd, a German officer approached under a white flag. He carried a typed message, a surrender demand from General Heinrich von Luttwitz. The message was formal, clinical. It offered McAuliffe 2 hours to decide: surrender, or the town would be destroyed. McAuliffe read it once, then he looked at his staff. He asked what he should say. Someone suggested, "How about nuts?" McAuliffe smiled. He wrote 1 word on a piece of paper: nuts. The German officer didn't understand. An American explained, "It means go to hell." Meanwhile, 150 miles to the south, General George Patton was preparing to cross the Saar River. His Third Army was poised to strike into Germany. The offensive had been planned for weeks. Men were ready, tanks were fueled, artillery was positioned. Then the phone rang. December 16th, late in the evening, It was General Omar Bradley. All hell had broken loose in the Ardennes. Patton was ordered to send one armored division north immediately. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division. Patton was furious. He had just lost a key unit on the eve of his attack, but he complied. He always did. Then Bradley called again. This time it was worse. There would be a meeting. December 19th, Verdun, France. Eisenhower wanted to see him. Patton knew what that meant. His offensive was over. Before he left for Verdun, he called his staff together. He gave them 3 code names, 3 contingency plans for a 90-degree turn to the north. Nickel, attack from Arlon to Bastogne. Dime, attack the tip of the Bulge. Cent, cut the Bulge at its base. He told them to prepare orders for all 3. Then he drove to Verdun. The meeting room was cold. 16 men sat around a long table. Eisenhower stood at the head. His face was drawn. He had just been promoted to 5-star general, General of the Army. Now, 3 days later, his front was collapsing. He opened the meeting with a single line. "This is an opportunity, not a disaster." Some of the officers looked skeptical. Patton did not. He leaned forward. He was listening. Eisenhower laid out the situation. The Germans had driven 40 miles into Allied territory. They had surrounded Bastogne. They were pushing toward the Meuse River. If they crossed it, the entire Allied strategy would unravel. Eisenhower wanted to hold the shoulders of the Bulge, then attack from both sides, north and south, pinch it closed, destroy the German spearhead. He turned to Patton. "George, how long will it take you to turn your army north and attack?" Patton didn't hesitate. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went silent. Some of the officers laughed. It was impossible. Patton's army was 150 miles away. His men were engaged on a different front. Turning an entire army in 2 days in winter under combat conditions was logistically insane. Eisenhower stared at him. "Make it 3 days, George. I want 6 divisions, not 3. Patton nodded. 3 days. Done. He left the conference room, walked to a phone, called his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay. He spoke 2 words. Play ball. That was the signal. The contingency plans were already in motion. The 4th Armored Division began moving north that night. The 80th Infantry Division followed the next day. Then the 26th Infantry Division. Within 72 hours, Patton repositioned 6 full divisions, over 133,000 vehicles, more than 250,000 men, 62,000 tons of supplies. They traveled through snow, ice, and mud. Some units drove for 18 hours straight without rest. The average distance per vehicle was over 11 miles of repositioning. It was the largest and fastest redeployment of forces in American military history. Patton later wrote to his wife, Beatrice. He called it the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed, and in my opinion, the outstanding achievement of this war. This is my biggest battle. While Patton's army raced north, the men in Bastogne fought for survival. December 23 brought a break in the weather. The skies cleared. For the first time in a week, American planes could fly. C-47 transports took off from England, loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and food. They flew low over Bastogne, dropping supplies by parachute. The men on the ground cheered, some wept. They gathered the crates under fire, dragging them into cellars while German artillery pounded the drop zones. But it wasn't enough. The supplies lasted 2 days, maybe 3. And the Germans kept coming. On December 24, Christmas Eve, the Germans launched their largest assault yet. 18 tanks led the attack, carrying an entire battalion of infantry. They hit the western perimeter at dusk. The line buckled. Panzers rolled over American foxholes, crushing men into the frozen ground. But the 327th Glider Infantry held. They let the tanks pass, then stood up and cut down the infantry behind them with machine gun fire. The panzers that broke through divided into 2 columns. One tried to reach the town from the rear. They were met by 2 companies of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. Bazookas, anti-tank mines, close-quarters combat in the snow. By midnight, the German attack had stalled. 92 prisoners, 14 destroyed tanks. The line held. Barely. That same night, German bombers appeared over Bastogne. They dropped tons of ordnance. The town center erupted in flame. Buildings collapsed. An aid station took a direct hit. 21 men killed instantly. The bombing lasted 4 hours. When it stopped, the silence felt heavier than the explosions. McAuliffe walked the perimeter that night. He stopped at foxholes. He asked men how they were holding up. Most didn't answer. They just nodded. One soldier asked him when Patton was coming. McAuliffe looked at the horizon. "Soon," he said. Soon. Patton's lead division, the 4th Armored, was 12 miles south of Bastogne. 12 miles through German-held territory. 12 miles of minefields, roadblocks, and dug-in infantry supported by tanks. The weather had turned again. Snow fell in heavy sheets. Visibility dropped to 50 yards. Patton drove to the front in an open jeep. He wore only a lap robe against the cold. His 3-star insignia was the only marking on the vehicle. He visited command posts. He stood in the snow and talked to tank commanders. He told them to drive like hell. Don't stop. Don't wait for support. Just drive. On December 22nd, a battalion of the 4th Armored lost 33 tanks in a single engagement. The Germans were dug in along the ridges. Anti-tank guns, panzers, and defilade. Every advance cost blood. Patton was relentless. He pulled men from rear echelon units, cooks, clerks, bandsmen. He gave them rifles and put them on the line. 8,000 men who had never seen combat. He told them they were infantry now. Some of them died within hours, but the advance continued. December 25th, Christmas Day. The 4th Armored pushed to within 6 miles of Bastogne. They could hear the artillery fire from the siege. That afternoon, Patton's jeep was strafed by an American plane. Friendly fire. He dove into a ditch. When the firing stopped, he stood up, brushed off the snow, and kept moving. He didn't slow down. He didn't stop. That night, he wrote to Beatrice. He told her the breakthrough was close. He told her his prayer was working. December 26, 1944, late afternoon. First Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding Cobra King, an M4A3E2 Sherman jumbo tank from Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, led the final push toward Bastogne. His crew consisted of driver Private Hubert Smith, assistant driver Private Harold Hafner, gunner Corporal Milton Dickerman, and loader Private James Murphy. Bogus had taken command of Cobra King just 3 days earlier, on December 23rd, after the previous commander, Captain Charles Trover, was killed by a German sniper while standing in the turret. Behind Cobra King, a small task force of tanks and half-tracks from the 37th Tank Battalion and the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion prepared for the final assault. The task force was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who would later become Chief of Staff of the United States Army and the namesake of the M1 Abrams tank. The assault began with a massive artillery barrage. 2,340 shells rained down on German positions around the village of Eisenhower, the last obstacle before Bastogne. The plan was simple. Cobra King and Company C would punch through without stopping. The units behind them would mop up resistance. Boggis pushed Cobra King forward at full speed. Machine guns swept the road ahead. The tank crashed through roadblocks, destroyed German bunkers. The crew fought through intense resistance. 4 Shermans were lost on the approach, but Cobra King kept moving. At the northern edge of Eisenhower, Boggis encountered a large Belgian army pillbox, now occupied by German infantry. Gunner Milton Dickerman fired 3 shots. The bunker was destroyed. Then Boggis saw soldiers in American uniforms near the destroyed pillbox. He was cautious. Reports had warned of German soldiers disguising themselves as Americans. Boggis called out, "This is the 4th Armored!" One of the soldiers approached. He stuck out his hand. "I'm Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Engineers, 101st Airborne Division. Glad to see you." At 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944, the Siege of Bastogne was officially broken. The corridor Cobra King opened was narrow, less than a mile wide. The Germans still held the high ground on both sides. They poured artillery fire into the corridor all night. Trucks carrying ammunition and medical supplies had to run the gauntlet under fire. Some made it, some didn't. But the flow of supplies resumed. Wounded men were evacuated. Fresh troops moved in. At 5:10 p.m., Lieutenant Colonel Abrams shook hands with General Anthony McAuliffe inside Bastogne. The relief was complete. On December 27, General Maxwell Taylor, the commander of the 101st Airborne, arrived in Bastogne. He had been in the United States when the siege began. Now he resumed command. McAuliffe stepped aside without complaint. He had done his job. Patton visited Bastogne on January 8, 1945. He traveled in an open jeep marked only with his 3 stars. The cold was brutal. Wind cut through the ruins like a blade. He toured the perimeter. He stopped at foxholes. He talked to men from the 101st. He asked them how they held out. Most of them shrugged. They didn't have an answer. They just did. One paratrooper told him they knew he was coming. That's why they held. Patton didn't reply. He just nodded. Then he moved on. Later, he wrote in his diary, "I hope the troops get the credit for their great work." He knew the headlines would focus on the generals, but the battle had been won by men in frozen foxholes who refused to quit. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the Battle of the Bulge. The fighting continued for another 3 weeks. Patton's Third Army pushed north toward Houffalize, fighting through snow and German resistance every mile. On January 16th, they linked up with the First Army, closing the Bulge. By January 25th, the front was restored. The German offensive had failed. Hitler's last gamble in the West was over. The cost was staggering. American casualties exceeded 80,000 men, 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, 15,000 captured. German losses were even higher. 100,000 casualties, thousands of tanks and vehicles destroyed. But the Americans had held. They had turned a disaster into a victory. And at the center of that victory was a single operation: the relief of Bastogne. Patton wrote to his wife after the relief, "The relief of Bastogne is the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed, and in my opinion, the outstanding achievement of this war. Now the enemy must dance to our tune, not we to his. This is my biggest battle." Those words were not hyperbole. Patton understood what had been accomplished. He had moved 6 divisions 90 degrees in the middle of winter. He had attacked through snow, mud, and enemy fire. He had broken a siege that most military analysts thought was unbreakable, and he had done it in less than a week. The maneuver required perfect coordination, staff work at the highest level, logistics that bordered on the impossible, and absolute trust in the men executing the orders. Patton gave credit to his staff, to the discipline of his units, to the experience of his commanders. But the decision to act had been his. Eisenhower saw it clearly. Patton had delivered when it mattered most. Shortly after the relief, Eisenhower sent a personal message to Patton. The message was brief, direct, uncharacteristic of a man who rarely showed public emotion toward his subordinates. According to multiple historical accounts, Eisenhower told Patton he was the most capable combat general in the Army. For Eisenhower, who commanded millions of men across multiple theaters, that was the highest praise he could give. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact. Patton had proven himself in North Africa, in Sicily, in France. But Bastogne was different. Bastogne was the moment when his entire career crystallized into a single operation. Everything he had learned, everything he believed about speed, aggression, and decisive action, it all came together in those 10 days. If you've stayed with this story, you understand why it matters. This wasn't just tactics. This was leadership under the worst conditions imaginable. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe now. Because history doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes. And these echoes deserve to be heard. The relief of Bastogne became the defining image of American armored warfare. Fast, mobile, relentless. It validated Patton's doctrine, his belief that tanks should not be used defensively, that they should attack, that they should never stop moving. But there was a cost. Patton pushed his men beyond exhaustion. He demanded the impossible, and they gave it. Some of them didn't survive. The 4th Armored Division, which led the breakthrough, suffered heavy casualties. The relief operation cost the division approximately 1,000 men killed and wounded. The 37th Tank Battalion lost 5 men, with another 22 wounded and 5 missing. The 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion suffered 30 deaths and 180 wounded. Tank crews fought for days without rest. Some men fell asleep at their posts. Others kept going on adrenaline and orders. Patton knew the price. He wrote about it in his diary. He knew that every mile gained cost lives. But he also knew that hesitation would cost more. If Bastogne fell, the entire southern shoulder of the Bulge would collapse. The Germans would have a clear road to the Meuse. The war could drag on for months, maybe longer. So he pushed, and his men followed. After Bastogne, Patton's Third Army continued east. They crossed the Rhine. They drove into Germany. They liberated concentration camps. They reached Czechoslovakia. Patton never stopped moving. Even after the war ended, he kept pushing. He wanted to keep going, to Berlin, to Moscow if necessary. But by then, the political situation had changed. The war was over. Patton's role was finished. On December 9, 1945, Patton was injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He spent 12 days in traction at a hospital in Heidelberg. On December 21, 1945, he died. A blood clot had moved to his heart. He was 60 years old. His wife, Beatrice, had to decide where he would be buried. She wanted him brought home to Massachusetts. The French government offered to bury him in Napoleon's tomb, alongside the great marshals of France. But General Geoffrey Keyes, who had served under Patton in North Africa and Sicily, made a suggestion. He should be buried with his men. The men of the Third Army who fell during the Battle of the Bulge. Beatrice agreed immediately. "Of course," she said. "I know George would want to lie beside the men of his army who have fallen." Patton was buried at the American Cemetery in Luxembourg, the same cemetery that holds the graves of men who died at Bastogne. At first, his grave was in the back corner, but so many people came to visit that the cemetery grounds were torn up. Workers moved his casket to a more central location. It didn't help. The crowds kept coming. Finally, they moved him to the front of the cemetery. Today, his grave faces the rows of white crosses, as if he were still leading them. One last time. The relief of Bastogne stands as one of the most remarkable military operations in American history. It was not won by a single decision. It was won by thousands of decisions. By tank commanders who kept moving under fire. By infantrymen who held frozen foxholes for days without sleep. By staff officers who coordinated supply lines in impossible conditions. And by a general who believed that speed and aggression could overcome any obstacle. Patton was not a perfect man. He was abrasive, arrogant. He made enemies. He slapped soldiers. He said things that ended careers. But when the moment came, when everything was on the line, he delivered. Eisenhower knew it. His men knew it. History knows it. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle in American military history. More than 600,000 American troops were involved. The fighting lasted 6 weeks. But the turning point came in 10 days. December 16th to December 26th. The Siege of Bastogne and its relief. That operation changed the course of the battle. It stopped the German advance. It gave the Allies time to regroup. And it set the stage for the final push into Germany. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, called it the greatest American battle of the war. He said it would be remembered as an ever-famous American victory. He was right. 80 years later, we still remember. We remember McAuliffe's defiant reply, "Nuts." We remember the paratroopers who held the line in sub-zero temperatures. We remember the tank crews who drove through minefields to reach them. And we remember the general who made it all possible, George S. Patton, Jr., the most capable combat general in the Army, the man who turned disaster into triumph, the man who believed that the only unforgivable sin in war was to stop moving. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what leadership really means, then share it, subscribe. Because these stories matter. They remind us what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. They remind us that courage is not the absence of fear. It's moving forward in spite of it. And they remind us that history is not made by perfect people. It's made by people who refuse to quit. Bastogne was not just a battle. It was a test. A test of will, of endurance, of trust. The men who fought there passed that test. They held the line when the line should have broken. They advanced when retreat seemed inevitable. They won when victory seemed impossible. And they did it because someone believed they could. Patton believed. Eisenhower believed. And most importantly, the men believed in each other. The roads around Bastogne are quiet now. The foxholes have been filled in. The tank tracks have faded. But the memory remains. In the white crosses at Luxembourg, in the museums that preserve the artifacts, in the stories passed down through generations. This is why we remember Bastogne. Not because it was the largest battle, not because it was the bloodiest, but because it showed what is possible when ordinary men are led by extraordinary conviction, when supply clerks become infantrymen, when tank crews drive for days without rest, when paratroopers hold a perimeter against impossible odds. That is the legacy of Bastogne. That is the legacy of Patton. And that is why 80 years later, his grave still faces his men, still leading them, still moving forward. Because that's what he did. He never stopped moving, and neither did they. This story was created with the support of artificial intelligence, but was thoroughly researched, fact-checked, and curated by a human historian. Every detail you heard was verified against primary sources, including military archives, official army records, and first-hand accounts from the men who were there. We believe history deserves accuracy, not embellishment.